Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the concept of individualism and how it is, in organic development terms, uniquely Western, and how that individualism has created or has led to a situation where the West has been, in social construction terms, has been uniquely vulnerable to treachery within. If your government, for example, in a society of individuals sells out to a supranational body of some sort without your knowledge or consent, then it's created a treacherous upper class that are selling out the very people they purport to represent. But because that society is made up of individuals rather than tribes or groups, it's slow to realise and slow to respond, given the social trust and so on that's built up in societies where individualism has achieved primacy. So let's just have a look at that development of individual. Now, there are quite a few components, and the subject's too big here to really condense into a short video, but I'll do my best from an overview perspective. Now, the beginning of individualism is the ability to own land and to have some sort of say in how you'll be taxed. Now, this originally was a relationship between the aristocracy and the monarch, say in the case of England, the Magna Carta and all that sort of thing, where there are three things. You can't tax us without our consent. You can't steal our property, our land. We own that land, and you can't throw us in prison without a trial. So those things are really, that was the kicking off. Now, this wasn't meant to be something that would be universal in creating individualism. That sort of seeped through via osmosis over time. But that was the sort of the earlier building blocks of it. And not that it was a complete done deal back in the time. King John was continually smouldering about that he thought that he'd been railroaded into the deal, the Magna Carta, and sought to reverse various aspects of it. It was still going to and fro, really, the power of the monarch versus the aristocracy primarily. And that really wasn't sorted out clearly until probably the late 1600s. I'd maybe put what was called the Glorious Revolution in, I think it was 1688, where the Parliament, which was primarily made up of aristocrats, the Parliament removed the king on the basis that the commitment to the freedoms of the primarily the aristocracy weren't being satisfactorily recognised. There are also issues to do with Protestant religion and Catholic religion, that sort of thing. But really it was that Glorious Revolution where the primacy of the people and their rights from that point on always exceeded that of the arbitrary power of the sovereign, so the monarch. So that was sort of in modern terms. Now, we also look at a few other things here that are critical to understand, I believe. One is a Protestant religion. Now, this was, I think, very key. Religion up at that time, whether whatever you look at, whether it's Islam or Catholicism or whatever, the arbiters, the interpreters, the conduits to the heavens were the priests or the mullahs or whatever, depending whatever religion it was. And the Protestant religion, kicking off with Martin Luther King, and even some thinkers sort of before that were really working up to that point where, well, not Martin Luther King, excuse me, Martin Luther. And Martin Luther in medieval Germany said, well, hey, really the relationship between the person and their conscience and their soul should be directly with God and not through an intermediary Now, this created the individual was then relating to God directly, rather than a bunch of people through an elite of the priesthood. And now the individualism in Catholic countries and the individualism in Protestant countries, you could see the divergence occurring there. Now, once people were dealing directly with God, then it was incumbent on them in order to understand the Word of God, given there was no longer an intermediary that was, not that there weren't priests, there were, but the idea you could only communicate to God through the priest. So literacy began to increase in the Protestant countries, northern Germany and in Britain and in the Netherlands. Now, it's no surprise that the Industrial Revolution, the scientific method, if you like, the modern Renaissance, and they kicked off largely in those places, in England, the Netherlands, and northern Germany. So the idea of the individual. Now, once that was established, the individual could own land and was subject to the law. Now, the law was, whilst it was codified, it was nonetheless abstract. So the law was not the interpretations of, say, again, a mullah in the case of the Islamic religion, or even the rabbis in a synagogue or something. The law was codified and clear. So the individual was the rights of the individual there was enshrined in law, given that the law was an abstract principle in one sense, but it was codified clearly in another, so that people that were subject to the law and were subject to the direct relationship with God via their conscience and their soul. So again, this opened up the idea of the individual free to associate. So there's freedom of association, also freedom of ideas to an extent that you didn't see in other societies. And this was essential for the scientific revolution, the agricultural revolution in Western Europe, and of course the industrial revolution. Now, it doesn't mean to say that Catholic societies weren't also capable of innovation. There are many innovations in, for example, the Italian city-states as a case in point, or in modern day France. But if you sort of look at the structure of how that was arrived at, that scientific method, the scientific revolution, and so on, had gone through those areas as well, and had created very much an attitude of the individual. So, for example, the Medici could walk past a sculptor in the town square in Florence, wherever it was, and there was a young guy there sculpting. He thought, "Wow, that's really good. You know what? I'm going to pay you to create statues and paint things and so on." And that young sculptor was Michelangelo. And so there was innovation in the arts and other areas as well. But it comes back to this idea of the individual that didn't exist in other societies, or to whatever extent it did exist, didn't exist to that same extent. Now, in places like, again, northern Germany and Britain, particularly Britain or England, Netherlands, that concept of the individual grew and grew, and not only was it an individual that's related to, so your relationship to power was through your elected representatives, and you chose your representatives, which happened, of course, after the French Revolution. That particularly took off there, but is also evident in Britain before that, and it increased quite rapidly during the industrial era. So the individual became very much the building block of a society with high social trust, and where the cooperation between the individual, the abstractions of power, and the state in terms of political representatives and indeed religion, I've mentioned before, was based around the individual, including, of course, individual ownership of land, which, by the way, wasn't widespread around the world at the time. That was not per se uniquely British, but as the wealth of the middle class and others grew in Britain, and it sort of blossomed out wealth that went out beyond the aristocracy, which in feudal times it was really only the aristocrats that had had the assets and thus the land, then individuals could own, middle class and even upper working class could own blocks, and they were protected by those laws that considered the individual and the property they owned. So it's very unique, this idea of the individual. But what does it do if you are indeed electing your representatives and they do represent you, and land ownership? And you could argue taxation cut across the idea of the individual, and that they agree to pay these taxes. But if you get a government that's captured by a supranational body, we'll call it the globalist cabal, for want of a better word, they successfully captured, going after World War II, and certainly from, say, the give or take the mid 80s onwards, they pretty much began a process and completed, in some cases, certainly in the USA, process of capturing pretty much all the Western governments and all the many, if not all, of the institutions, whatever institutions they hadn't captured and controlled by then, ideologically that is, they would do so in the ensuing years. So you had a government that the only way that such a situation came into place was because of very high social trust and codification of law that was applied equally, independent courts, all that sort of thing, elected representatives representing the will of the people. Now, that was all chipped away at, so it was all removed, so that eventually, and again in a fairly short space of time as we think about it, that these governments no longer represented the people. Those uncouth, vulgar people that shouldn't have had any right to participate in government anyway. Now, we'll keep the illusion of it with voting, but we'll just make sure that everybody who stands for election is controlled and owned by the globalist cabal. I wouldn't, years ago, I wouldn't have thought that was possible. If somebody had said to me, when say I was a high school kid or something, you know what, all these Western governments are all going to be taken over by this globalist cabal and they're going to turn against their own people, and I would have thought that was impossible. Not in a democratic country, that just couldn't happen, I would have said to myself. The independent judges and courts would never allow it. The politicians would never, and so on. But when you consider about how easily and quickly it's been done, that really the resistance against it, or those who would oppose it, were systematically removed, condemned. They would there'd be gigabytes of child porn would magically appear on their computers, and 100 women all complaining they were raped by somebody would magically appear on demand. These people, anyone that would oppose this, was got rid of pretty quickly, and those that didn't were either threatened or bribed, so that in the end the entire body politic of the Western world became controlled by the globalist cabal. I wouldn't have thought it was possible, but yet here we are, and this is what's happened and what's going on. So the governments now, because they were dealing with individuals in high trust, they were able to say, "Oh yeah, we still represent you. That's all right," and then they would start mass migration. They would start applying the law harshly to one group but not another, and so on. And so they would infiltrate, that they would turn the police force into globalist enforcers. They would turn the legal system into politicized hack goon stooges. They would do all these things without the consent of the people. But the contract was that anything the government wants to do must be with the consent of the people. And when you're dealing with individuals, rather than groups or gangs or tribes, then you're much more able to do these sorts of things, because of the high levels of social trust that have been built up. Your belief in the law, your belief in the courts, your belief in the government, your belief in democracy. So it's because of all of these things that we believed in the West that allowed these people to infiltrate and to take over. So now governments, not just willfully, that they act in open defiance of the wishes of the people, and the idea that the people decide or have input into what the government does is just, it just doesn't happen anymore. So all the big questions, all the big issues, mass migration or not, and all this is all decided by the globalist cabal, and then is forced by their flunky gobbling little stooges in the across the Western governments. So individualism, I would argue, was the greatest asset to the West in wealth creation, innovation, industrial revolution, organizational development, all of these, spontaneous collaboration, all of wealth creation, all of these sort of things. Individualism was an essential component of all that. But it also left the door open, which was aggressively exploited by the globalist cabal and their supranational organization, and they have corrupted the Western world to an extent and degree that we never could have imagined. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.